Well, good evening, everybody. I hope you all are doing well. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Let me fix my microphone here, get this up a little bit. Um, if you guys can just give me a thumbs up that you can hear me and everything's going well, we'll get started here pretty quickly. I got an early start tonight, so I thought might as well jump on this so it doesn't go too late. So again, if you can hear me, put something in the chat so I know that I'm actually getting out live. So nothing yet. Oh, there we go. Thank you for replying. So now I know you guys can hear me. We're gonna get going, and I'm gonna be honest. I am going to go through this rather quickly. The PowerPoint I have is very detailed, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading the whole PowerPoint to you. So if you see some slides that you want to, you want more information and stuff, just snap a picture. You can always go back and watch this because the recording will be available on YouTube once we're done. And yeah, I'm in a different room, so the dog, he's going to be around pretty much most of the night. So anyway, so let me get over here to the PowerPoint. So basically, we are covering the time period from 1898 to 1920. When we look at this, basically, we are going all the way from imperialism through, the early, stages, or, the early times of the 1900s, jumping into World War I, and then going into the 1920s. Those are the three big topics for this exam. Imperialism, World War I, and the 1920s. So let me hop onto this screen over here, and I got my chat open so I can see that. So, all right. So, guys, there's a ton of vocabulary in this unit. This is just the vocabulary for imperialism. So that's going to be the key when you're preparing tonight, is reviewing all this vocabulary. And if you understand what everything is, then you're golden. If there's stuff you don't know, you need to go back and look it up. So when we talk about imperialism, the big ideas here are we're talking about the territorial expansion of the United States. We've been expanding our country since the 1790s, and but once Manifest Destiny was reached, now what? That becomes a question. 1893, Turner's going to say that the frontier is closed, meaning we've expanded as far as we possibly could. So the challenge is, what do we do now? Where's that wilderness we're trying to conquer? I was talking to someone this morning explaining that, America has always been defined as this country that has this edge between civilization and wilderness. And that was the draw, to conquer the wild. Well, it's all been conquered now. So the question becomes, where do we go from here? And so what we're going to see happening is that search for expansion. America is actually going to become a global power through this idea of imperialism. The main motivating factors for imperialism is going to be economic, political, military, and ideological. Economically, we're looking for new markets for our goods. Politically, we're looking to build up our reputation within the world. We're trying to build up our power. As we grow, we're going to need more access to military bases, specifically for our Navy. That's going to draw back to Alfred T. Mahan. That's a name you need to know, where he is going to write a book called The Influence of Sea Power, where he basically says that countries that are strong have strong navies. And if we're going to have a strong navy, we need places throughout the world for them to dock, for them to go to, to refuel, to resupply, whatever it is. And then finally, the last part of imperialism is going to be this ideological principle that we need to go out to the world and basically save the world from itself. These cultures that aren't like ours, that might have different beliefs, different lifestyles, stuff like that, we're going to step into what's known as the white man's burden. You can make the argument that this is just a continuation of social Darwinism. And survival of the fittest, but now we're going to go out and help others build themselves up. And remember, throughout this entire time, it wasn't just the United States doing this. This is a lot of European countries, England and France and Germany and other places. So this was literally a global race to imperialize the quote, unclaimed territories of the world. The first place the United States is going to go is Hawaii. Hawaii was a very lucrative spot for us just because of the location. It's pretty much dead center in the Pacific Ocean, which would allow us to make it to Asia, to make it to a lot of the Pacific Islands and stuff. And as we talked in class, we started in Hawaii with missionaries, and then that's going to evolve into, the missionaries overthrowing the sitting government, which was Queen Liliuokalani, who was trying to have her people maintain the power of the islands, but the planters will revolt, overthrow the king, overthrow the queen, implant their own government, and then at that point apply to the United States to be annexed in. And that's going to happen in 1898 by William McKinley. As we go forward, that 1898, a lot of stuff happened in that year. It's a great anchor point for remembering when stuff happened in history. Hey, shh, quiet. Sorry, I gave my dog some bones, and he chews it up and swallows it halfway, and then barks to hack it up again. So we got to deal with that tonight. All right, next is Cuba. Cuba is probably going to be... whereas Hawaii is part of our imperialism, Cuba is really going to be what shoves us out or throws us out into the world. The Cubans are actually going to start this when they revolt against the Spanish rule there. And as we talked about in class, the Cubans are going to deal with General Weyler and the reconcentration policy that he put in place. But America has always been fascinated with Cuba, but we're looking at Cuba now just because of the investments we have down there. Because through the different diplomacies of American presidents and stuff like that, we have started to expand into Latin and Central America. And that was especially during the Gilded Age. Well, so we have sugar plantations right there in Cuba. So we do have an economic interest in what's going on between Cuba and Spain. Because of that, you're going to see the media pick up the mantle to get the United States involved in this war. That's when we start to see the beginning of the use of yellow journalism, extreme headlines and stuff like that to get the American people to buy into this idea that we should go to war. And then what's going to happen is we're going to send the Maine in. The USS Maine is going to go in just as a show of force to protect our interests, really not to take any action, but just to be there. Okay, we're here, so don't mess with our plantations. Well, the Maine's going to explode. We know now it was a boiler that caused that, but at the time there was a debate about what caused it, and of course, all the yellow journalism, it was Spain. So that's going to drive us closer to the idea of declaring war against Spain. And then finally, the DeLome letter is going to come in. The letter that kind of just talks smack about President McKinley being weak and stuff like that. And all of this, combined together is going to get the United States to declare war against Spain. And we're not just going to be fighting in Cuba, but we'll also be fighting in the Philippines as well. So we're going to be fighting a two-front war during the Spanish-American War. 1898 is when we declared war. There's that year again. The United States took a very, a proactive approach, kind of heading off anybody headed them off at the front there, saying, we're not doing this to take Cuba. This is not about imperialism. And so that's why we're going to add the Teller Amendment to our declaration of war that literally said, we don't want Cuba. The war is only going to last a couple months. We're going to have victories. The big victories are going to be by George Dewey in the Philippines and by Teddy Roosevelt in Cuba. Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. August of 1898, the war will end. So we're talking, 3.5 months that we fought this war. Shh. Seriously, stop. So the impact, though, John Hayes said it was a splendid little war, but the long-lasting impact is honestly, I think, still being felt a little bit today. The first question we had is, what do we do with these territories that we acquired? Because through the Treaty of Paris of 1898, we're going to get Guam. We're going to get Cuba's going to come in, but not as a territory of the United States, but instead a protectorate of the United States. But we will get control of Puerto Rico, and when, Germany expresses interest in the Philippines, we're going to bring the Philippines in as well. There is a lot of debate in Congress over this, about bringing these lands in, and you actually have this anti-imperialist league led by people like Andrew Carnegie and Mark Twain saying, this is not what's good for our country. This is not who we are. But McKinley does favor expansion. So the anti-imperialists are really going to be shot down not only by McKinley, but by a lot of supporters of imperialism within the Congress. The Teller Amendment, yeah, we do leave Cuba. We actually get completely out of Cuba, with regards to our military presence by 1902, but we didn't do that until we passed the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment is what made Cuba an official protectorate of the United States. And in this amendment, we basically said that the amendment that's, that Cuba signed off on and everything like that, that we can intervene and restore peace and order if they ever have any type of insurrections or stuff like that. Cuba does not have the ability to sign treaties without our approval. And then we get that perpetual naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Bottom line, the Platt Amendment is kind of set up as like a big brother approach to Cuba. We're going to give you a limited form of independence. You'll have a limited government, but we're going to be looking over your shoulder to make sure you're doing it right. And that's what I mean when I say that the effects of the Spanish-American War are still being felt today, because there's going to be a long-lasting tension between the United States and Cuba, and that's what leads to the Cuban Revolution in the 50s when Fidel Castro rises up, and Cuba has still kind of been a thorn in our side even to this day. So still playing the game today. All right, Puerto Rico is the next major territory that comes from the Treaty of Paris. Now, we're going to pass the Foraker Act in 1900, which again grants some limited popular sovereignty to Puerto Rico, but we're not giving them full self-rule. We're still the governing authority there, but they can have some small local, government, what's the word I'm looking for? Establishments or stuff like that. Puerto Ricans are going to be granted U.S. citizenship in 1917. And really, this is all part of this question that we have with all these new territories. It's a one thing to bring in a bunch of new territories into the United States, but what happens when we bring them in? What happens to the people who live there? Do they become American citizens? Do they get the same rights and protections as American citizens? And does the Constitution cover them? And that's where the insular cases come from. These were the Supreme Court cases where the Supreme Court basically says that the Constitution doesn't necessarily follow the flag. We can fly our flag above some of these territories. That does not guarantee the rights of citizenship to the people who live there. And that's what we see happening, in the Philippines, in Guam to a point, and other places as we start to expand. The Philippines, though, are not going to be too happy about all this, because they actually believed that in fighting with the United States against Spain, that the Treaty of Paris would grant them their own independence. And that didn't even happen at all. I mean, we gave more freedom to Cuba than we did the Philippines. And a lot of that had to do with that whole idea that we had about white man's burden. That, the Philippine people were not ready to govern themselves. That's going to lead to a insurrection or a civil war, if you will, in the Philippines, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, where he will fight a guerrilla-style war for several years against the United States, where, the casualty numbers were extremely high. The behavior of some of the American soldiers was extremely vile and went against everything that the military stood for. But what's going to end up happening is we will see a truce, if you will, or a peace will be restored when Taft will be appointed the governor of the Philippines. He'll go in and they'll start building local governments and building a legislative structure along with the Philippines. They're still under U.S. control, but, Taft goes in and we put some infrastructure in, we put schools in, and we also bring their culture into the local governments that we're building. The Philippines will eventually gain their independence. It will be given on July 4th, 1946. So 1 year after World War II ends, and of course on July 4th. The Philippines, Hawaii, both of these played key roles in getting the United States to be able to access the markets in China. We talked about in class how other countries were already there. You had Russia was there, Japan was there, England, France. They all had these spheres of influence in China. So we are a little late coming to the game. But what we'll see happen is Secretary of State John Hay, is basically going to propose the open door policy in 1899. And the purpose of that was to create basically an open door for anybody to go in and trade in China. And that's going to be kind of a tough sell to some of these other foreign countries because they already have their foot in the door. We try to push our way through the door, first of all, by saying, since they never really replied to our request about the open door policy, that should mean we could go in. But I think what really got us into China was our response to the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion were people in China who rebelled against the government, rebelled against the foreign influence that's coming into their country because they want to protect their traditional values. Well, this went on for a couple years, and it's going to be when the United States comes into China and they actually build an international coalition with the other European entities there, and they're going to be able to put down the Boxer Rebellion. Because of that, that's going to give us some credibility with the Chinese government. That's going to allow us to go in and actually start to create our own influence in the markets as well. So now the United States has spread all the way over to Asia. So we're basically going completely across the Pacific. We're going down into Latin America. We're going down into Central America. And that's that's where our imperialistic goals were driving us. They're not driving us to, the western part of the world, to Europe or Africa or places like that. They're driving us further east. Roosevelt is going to take the presidency after McKinley is assassinated. And what we'll see with regards to foreign policy is that Roosevelt is going to increase the power of the presidency. His foreign policy was big stick diplomacy, the idea that you build a large military and, that large military does the talking for you. So basically you have a military to back up what you're saying, and you won't have to use the military because people do not want to get involved in that war. But he is going to continue to pursue this expansionist ideas that were introduced during McKinley's presidency. And he's going to primarily be looking more so into, I think, Latin America and places like that. When we look at it, where he wants is the Panama Canal. The first attempt was years ago. France tried to build a canal. It's not like we came up with this idea to dig a ditch through Panama and say, hey, look, our ships can go through. We'll cut this, travel time in half. It had been explored before, but Colombia, who had control of the Panamanian region, said no. Now, that doesn't mean Roosevelt's not going to try. He's going to try to get Colombia to work with us. He's going to try to set up like a lease and stuff like that. And Colombia's, again, going to say no. At about this time, there is this rumblings of a possible revolution in Panama. And it's not that America got involved, but Roosevelt encouraged it. He said, hey, yeah, if you want to declare some independence, why not? And so this Panamanian revolution is going to start. And though the United States doesn't get involved, we're going to send our Navy down there. Roosevelt was famous for building the Great White Fleet and building our Navy because he's following those principles that Mahan had talked about, the influence of sea power. And so he's going to send our Navy down just off the coast of Panama, just as for show. It's like, we're just doing some military exercises here. We're not involved in this revolution. But the U.S. presence does have an effect. The Panamanians are going to win this revolution. The Hay-Bonneau-Varilla Treaty is basically going to bring this to an end, and we're going to set this treaty up with Panama to build the Panama Canal. And so this will become Roosevelt's big, huge project. He is going to oversee this Panama Canal. That's going to be his baby down there. He's also going to protect our interest in Latin America by adding in, or by putting an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. It's called the Roosevelt Corollary. Now, the Roosevelt Corollary is just the first step in literally 100 years of America starting to use our influence within the Western Hemisphere, and then it's going to expand to the rest of the world. Started with the Monroe Doctrine in 23. Now the Roosevelt Corollary is being added to that. And basically what it says is that the United States is taking more of a oversight role in the Western Hemisphere, and we will act as an intermediary between Europe and the Latin American countries, and and our role throughout Latin America and Central America is going to increase because we are taking this intermediary role. We're taking this oversight role. So we're going to start moving our military into different areas of Latin America to protect our interests, but also to protect these Latin American countries and stuff. The Roosevelt Corollary, while it does calm the waters between, like England and Germany and some Latin American countries, specifically Venezuela, and it does allow U.S. markets to grow and also some of the Latin American countries to grow and stuff, it will eventually start to create tension between some of these Latin American countries and the United States. I think one in particular is going to be Mexico. It's going to cause tension down the road. But it's once again the United States expanding its influence, expanding its power into other parts of the world. And again, we're still, our primary goal is not to bring land in, but to increase our economic markets. Roosevelt is also going to play a key role over in Asia. Some of the things he did was he helped negotiate a peace in the Russo-Japanese War. When he does that at the Treaty of Portsmouth, he is actually going to negotiate this peace, and it was a great thing that he's able to do, but it's also there's concern with what's going on with Japan over in China, and that's Russia and Japan were fighting over more territory in Asia, so the peace was intended to to slow the expansion of Japan into the Asian continent. So that treaty is going to be negotiated. He's going to win a Nobel Peace Prize for that. Another major piece of legislation that he's going to negotiate is the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan. We had laws coming up in California that was creating segregation between Asian immigrants and white Americans. Segregated schools were set up. We were afraid of the, quote, yellow peril of, the influence of Asians coming into our country. And so what TR is going to do is he's going to negotiate a compromise with Japan, saying, okay, I will work on ending the segregation in California, getting California to repeal those laws, and at the same time, we want you to restrict any new immigrants from coming over to the United States. Don't send any more Japanese workers to the United States. And so that's the Gentleman's Agreement. You can think of that as a almost a continuation or a addition to the Chinese Exclusion Act from 1882. And of course, I already mentioned TR and the Great White Fleet. Still think that's a great story when he just painted up a bunch of old ships to make our Navy look big and powerful while he was in the midst of building that Navy. All right. I'm not going to go into depth with regards to the foreign policies of Taft and Wilson. Be familiar, though, with dollar diplomacy. That's going to be Taft, and moral diplomacy. That's going to be Wilson. Just know the difference. Review your notes. Make sure you know exactly kind of what they were both trying to do. What I really want to get to, this is not even on the test, but just remember that there was a division in the Republican Party. This was part of the progressive test, so don't worry about this. But so this is how Wilson got elected. And Wilson, like I mentioned to you guys in class, had no foreign policy experience going forward, which is interesting because this is what he's going to have to deal with. He's going to have to deal with World War I. And again, terminology. Here's a lot of the stuff you need to know. Make sure you're familiar with each of these different terms going forward. Take a picture, do whatever you have to do. I'll give you a count of 5 if you want to do that while I drink some water. All right, so let me see one thing, check one thing here real quick, guys. All right, so World War I. World War I is going to get started over in Europe. We're not going to get into why it started over there. Remember remember the alliances. Remember Maine, that it was militarism, the building up an arms race in Europe between the countries. Alliances played a key role in this. Make sure you understand that probably more than anything, alliances are really going to lead to this war. Imperialism. You have everyone trying to expand, trying to grow their territory, and finally nationalism, protecting our culture and stuff like that. And we're seeing kind of history repeating itself a little bit right now with what's going on over with Russia and Ukraine. I mean, that's a debate over nationalism, if you will. So anyway, so that's why the war started over there. But let's look about why we got involved. And the primary reasons we got involved in the war, that we finally went over there because we were trying to remain neutral, was the fact that our neutrality was being violated. You had the sinking of the Lusitania. You have this the Sussex Pledge, where Germany says, okay, yeah, we're not going to sink any more ships and stuff like that. And then they came back and said, never mind, we're going to go into unrestricted warfare. They said that in 1917. And they are going to start using their submarines to go after American ships. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is the Zimmerman Note. If you remember correctly, Germany is going to contact Mexico. We had some problems with Mexico, in 1914, 1915, where Pancho Villa was coming in and trying to engage the United States in a war because we had helped overthrow their dictator down there. What was his name? Madero or something like that. And so Germany sees this weakness between the United States and Mexico, the tension, and they're going to try to use that. And they send this telegram to Mexico saying, hey, if you engage the United States in war and keep them focused on that side of the world, when we win this little thing over here in Europe, we're going to give you New Mexico back, we're going to give you Arizona back, all that territory you lost in the Mexican-American War, we're going to make sure you get all of that back. And then finally, the last reason, and probably what Wilson will use as his number one reason for why the United States went to war, is we wanted to make the world safe for democracy. That kind of falls into his moral diplomacy ideas, that we need to spread democracy throughout the world. Now, he thought we could do it without war, but obviously going into World War I, that's not going to be the case. But this is why America gets involved into World War I. We are not prepared to go to war at all. We declare war in 1917, and then we have the draft. We didn't have the military ready to go, so it's going to take us about 10 months before we can actually send troops overseas. We're going to pass the Selective Service Act, which is going to draft men into the Army, and we're going to create the American Expeditionary Force. We're going to send about 1 million men over to Europe under the command of John J. Pershing. What you're going to see in America is what we call total war, where every single part of the United States, every part of our economy, every part of our military is going to be involved in this war. And we're going to look to Americans themselves who are here at home to be fully involved in the war. We're going to start funding it through a rise of income taxes. We passed the 16th Amendment, so now we can collect income taxes. And then finally, then we're going to also start selling war bonds, or liberty loans is what we called them. And you'll see that in several wars. You're going to see that, especially in World War II. Now, very specific federal agencies are going to be created during this time that you really need to know. So you need to know about the National War Labor Board. Their whole purpose was to keep America working. They're going to try to put down any type of rising union problems and stuff like that. We do experience the steel strike during World War I, but it's up to the National War Labor Board to keep America working. They had the support of the AFL. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, started by Samuel Gompers. The AFL took a stand of you should not strike during a war. The IWW, the Industrial Workers League, basically started by, oh my gosh, what's his name? Ran for president. Someone will type it in there. But they're going to oppose the National War Labor Board because they thought the best time to strike was during a war because that's when you're going to get the best response. Debs, Eugene V. Debs, that's who it was. They're also going to start the War Industries Board. The War Industries Board is going to be in charge of producing goods and for all the needs of fighting, weapons, bullets, tanks, jeeps, whatever. I mean, they're going to shift American industry from producing consumer goods to producing military goods. You're also going to have the U.S. Food Administration, and their job is going to be focused on conservation, asking Americans to conserve so that food can get over to our soldiers overseas. There was one other committee you should know about, and I'm drawing a blank on the name. You can look it up, but it's the committee that dealt with propaganda and putting, these ideas out and stuff like that. It might be on my next slide. I can't remember. During this time, it's going to be when we pass the 18th Amendment. That's going to be the Prohibition Amendment. And it's going to grow. The support for the Volstead Act and the 18th Amendment is going to grow. And really the reason why is they're going to use Germany, our enemy in the war, to promote prohibition because beer came from Germany. So why not just put the two together? Germany's bad, beer is bad. Let's go to prohibition. I mean, that was kind of some of the thinking there. So that's going on there. There we go. There it is. The Committee of Public Information is another one you need to know. Their job was to get that propaganda out, to get Americans behind the war. They were going to do that through, selling bonds, getting people in the military, drafting people, dehumanizing the enemy, just anything they could to put out, to get people behind this war. Now, I lost my train of thought, but a lot of it was just pure propaganda. And in the video that you watched that I did for you, I showed you all the different posters that they made. And we'll see those in World War I. We'll see the same thing in World War II. It's funny, we haven't seen those in any other wars. We never saw those in the Korean War. We never saw those in Vietnam or anything else. But World War I and II, they did create these committees to support the war and get Americans to support the war. Another thing they used was what was called 4-Minute Men. These guys were great. This was where you saw basically men would go out and speak for 4 minutes on behalf of the war, and they would get very famous people to do this. That picture that you have there, I showed you in the video, that's Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks, who were two of the most famous actors at the time. And so that's how a lot of, celebrities at the time are going to start using their voices as 4-Minute Men. Two major acts are going to be passed during this time, the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. This exact same thing that we heard about when John Adams was president. And the Sedition Act says you cannot criticize the government. The Espionage Act, gave them control over who could come and who could, come and go from our country. We didn't want spies to get in. And like I said, we had a very strong anti-German sentiment in our country. Because, that's when they got the nickname the Huns. And, all those posters dehumanized them. If you remember correctly, some of the posters I showed you was, how they, a lot of them were attacking women and stuff like that. So that's how they did it. That's how they promoted American involvement in this war. One of the major Supreme Court cases you should know from World War I is Schenck versus the United States. You had some anti-draft notices that were mailed out to the American people after the Selective Service Act was passed, and Schenck is going to sue the U.S. government because they're going to refuse to deliver those. And what's decided in this court case is very simple. Congress, the government, does have the power to restrict freedoms during a time of war when there is a clear and present danger. And so in this case, those anti-draft notices were stopped because they were able to restrict freedom of speech, because we're fighting this war and we can't have, negative ideas going out about that war. So that's what this court case decided. So that's one you need to know. Schenck versus the United States. Homefront, what's going on during the war is, number one, is the Great Migration. A lot of men go off to work, and there's a lot of jobs in the North. That's going to pull a lot of African Americans from the South trying to escape the Jim Crow laws and the segregation and the discrimination and all the evil things that were happening down in the South. I mean, this was, Jim Crow. That was a time period of lynchings and people just being dragged out of their home and beaten to death and stuff like that. So the jobs are going to allow, hundreds of thousands of African Americans to move north looking for jobs in these factories. So you're also going to have African Americans serving in the war. 400,000 will serve. They will still be segregated. They most will not be allowed to go to the front. There were some exceptions. You had some exceptions with the Harlem Hellfighters, but I think they fought for the French army and stuff like that. But 400,000 African Americans served in the war, and without them, there's no way we could have won that war. They were the ones who kept the supply lines going. W.E.B. Du Bois believed, and a lot of people believed, that this would help lead to more equality, but it didn't. When the African Americans came home, they're not only coming home to the same problems that existed before they left, but now new problems, because now they're competing with all these other soldiers coming back, and so they're competing for jobs, they're competing for houses, and that's going to lead to the race riots. We saw a little bit about that in the video we watched yesterday. We saw that when we talked about, in class, we talked about the Chicago race riot and stuff like that. All of that was due to the Great Migration and then the competition in northern cities for jobs as well as for housing. Women also play a key role. They're going to start working in the factories, and it's because of the women's contribution to World War I that Woodrow Wilson will finally push to get the 19th Amendment passed. The 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote. One more thing about African Americans, and I'll just throw this out as a kind of a placeholder. Really, what we're going to start seeing because of the reaction coming back from World War I think we're seeing the beginnings of the civil rights movement because of what happened during World War I. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. All right, Wilson, after the war, is going to venture off to Europe because he's going to want to be, he's part of the Treaty of Versailles and the negotiations for peace. Remember, he's trying to push his 14 points, freedom of the seas, disarmament of countries, no more alliances, reduction of colonization, that whole idea of peace without victory. But he has to compete with France and England, who are pushing for Article 151, that war guilt clause, that where Germany will take total responsibility for the war. So what we talked about in class is what's going to end up happening is both are going to be used in the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles is going to be passed. A lot of the 14 points are rejected, but then added in and stuff like that. But the big thing is the League of Nations is going to be included in the Treaty of Versailles. And that's going to be a tough sell for Wilson when he gets back to the United States. He's going to have the reservationists and the irreconcilables. Those are the two groups in Congress, the irreconcilables and the reservationists, who are going to oppose this League of Nations, oppose the Article 10 of the League document, saying that we will actually be surrendering some power to the League in cases of insurgency and stuff like that, and we were not comfortable with that. So Congress will reject, the League of Nations will reject the Treaty of Versailles. We never ratify it. So just remember that. All right, that's World War I. And now all we have left is the Roaring Twenties. I'm going to breathe here for a minute. If you guys have any questions, it's a great time for you to type them into the comments. Let's see. Woo. We got our little bit of a delay here, so I'll give you a few more seconds. All right. All right, let's get into the 1920s. Here is all your terminology for the 20s. Again, I would think a lot of this stuff, though, when you look at it, a lot of it should feel comfortable, hopefully, that it's comfortable as you look at it. All right. Coming out of World War I, going into the 1920s, you do have this real fear rising in our country of the spread of communism. A lot of it goes back to the Bolshevik Revolution, which occurred in 1917, which pulled Russia out of World War I. And like we talked about the other day in class, it wasn't just the Bolshevik Revolution, but it was what led to that in Russia and how we interpreted that to events that were happening here in the United States. The Bolshevik Revolution started with the Organization of Labor, and then you had strikes, and then strikes turned into riots. Riots turned into death threats, and all of that kind of rolled downhill and turned into a revolution to overthrow the government. Well, we have some similarities here in America. We do have organized labor. We do have strikes that have been going on since the 1870s, but two major strikes that I talked about in class, the steel strike and the Boston police strike, both kind of ring similar to what had happened over in Russia. And what really worried people is both of those strikes had to be put down by the National Guard. I already talked about the race riots, but that was just one more thing that added to the trepidation about our society and how that compared to the steps that occurred over in the Soviet Union. And then we can't forget there were anarchists among us. We talked about the bombings that were taking place, targeting government officials in 8 different cities across our country. Mail bombs were sent to these officials, and we realized that we did have a problem. Now, was it escalated to the point of what happened right before the Bolshevik Revolution? Absolutely not. But the fear was rising, and fear was driving a lot of the decisions that America was making at this time. That's what leads to the first Red Scare. The last year of Wilson's presidency, he is going to send Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, give him the power to start seeking out these anarchists, seeking out these supposed communists within our midst. And so what he's going to start doing is he's going to target social anarchists. He's going to target unions. He's going to target radicals or target anybody that they felt might be a threat to U.S. democracy. And Palmer's going to go overboard. He's going to start raiding, union meetings. He's going to start raiding, I read about how he raided some like adult education classes in the evening because that's where a lot of immigrants from South and South and East Europe have come from and stuff like that. And they will literally start deporting people back to their countries. Ellis Island became like a two-way thoroughfare. You had people coming in, and then you had the U.S. government sending people out as based on the fear of that them being radicals and anarchists. We're also going to pass new laws to limit immigrants coming into our country. You're going to have the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the National Quota Act of 1924. The purpose of these acts was to limit the new immigrants. Remember, the new immigrants are coming from South Europe and East Europe, so Russia and Italy and places like that. And so these two immigration laws were focused on preventing these groups from coming in. The Quota Act of 21 wasn't set up with the right parameters to do that, so that's why the National Quota Act of 24 was put in place. At the same time, though, as I mentioned in class on the other day, we still allowed unlimited immigration from the Western Hemisphere. So everyone from this side of the world, just come and go. I talked to you guys yesterday about Sacco and Vanzetti and how they were, the quintessential example of our fear during the Red Scare, where you have these two Italian immigrants known anarchists, known draft dodgers who are going to be accused and convicted of robbery and murder in 1921 in Boston. And though the evidence against them was very circumstantial, they will still be convicted and they will be executed. And a lot of people in our country and in other places of the world thought that injustice occurred here, that they were not given their due diligence. But that's what happened under this Red Scare. We're going to get to a second Red Scare in the 1950s, and you're going to see the same type of stuff, but even broader, I think. So, but we'll get to that. Then we also have these guys come back. You know, the KKK increases its influence in the country, and we saw that in the video yesterday. Where at their height, they had 4 million members. And they're expanding not only geographically, but ideologically, because now it's not just African Americans, it's immigrants, it's Catholics, it's radicals. And they're going to build their popularity with the biggest piece of garbage propaganda movie ever called Birth of a Nation. But that movie is going to capture the attention of the United States. It's going to capture the attention of the president. And it will be very popular. That will allow the KKK to increase their political influence in our country during this time as well. It does, you know, at the height, they're at 4 million. It's good. It will start going down. We still have, you know, we're still in the 1920s. We still have Jim Crow going on down in the southern states. So, you know, it's not like that went away. We still have segregation in our country and all this other stuff. So the influence of the KKK is still prevalent, and it will be prevalent going forward, but you won't see the height of membership like we saw in the 1920s for sure. Consumerism, huge. During the 1920s, people are coming back from war. We went through a little bit of an economic panic at the beginning of the 20s, but then all these factories are shifting back to consumer production. The stock market's going to start growing because people are being able to buy stock on speculation, taking out loans. Credit becomes a huge thing during the 1920s, where you can get all these new appliances that are now being created and buy them on time. You don't have, you know, $80 to buy that new refrigerator. Just pay us $5 a month, and it can be yours. And so, you know, get it today, pay for it tomorrow. I mean, credit comes to America in the 1920s, and we've never been able to escape it since. Stay away from it if you can. Because of all this new consumerism, advertising is going to take off as well. And so, you know, you're going to start seeing, you know, we saw, and you guys all got it on the, you know, the classes I asked. You all knew that the Wheaties cereal was the first official jingle in American history. So we start seeing that on the radio. The radio becomes the center of, you know, social life, family life, you know. People would sit around the radio every night just listening to the radio, listening, you know, and they had shows and stuff on the radio. It wasn't just like music. They had actual shows and dramas and stuff like that. So all of that's going on during the 1920s. The first radio broadcast in 1920 was announcing the victory of William Harding. And like I said, it brought the nation together. We're going to see the growth of other entertainment industries, specifically the movie industry. The Great American Train robbery was the first motion picture, but the first talking picture was called The Jazz Singer. And then once we have talking pictures, it's just going to grow even more from then. I also mentioned in class that for the first time we have a celebrity culture. Not just politicians anymore, but sports heroes and actors and stuff like that. Sporting events are going to become huge during the 1920s because of entertainment. That's another form of entertainment that we're going to be introduced to during this time. Socially, we're going to change. Women are going to literally just change completely. Once they got the right to vote and they start getting more of that independence, you're going to see women just start to blossom. We're going to have things like the Harlem Renaissance is going to start, where the African American culture is going to start to grow, and that culture will start to expand beyond Harlem, especially the music. Jazz will become, where it was predominantly an African American style of music that's going to spread to white America as well, and that's going to be added to the speakeasies and the drinking and the dancing during the 1920s. Women, like I said, they completely change, and that's when you see the flapper lifestyle come in. I said basically everything for women got shorter in the 1920s. Their hair got shorter, their dresses got shorter. They were living their independence. We also were seeing some challenges to some fundamental ideas of our country with the introduction of Darwinism, the evolution and stuff like that. And so you'll have the fundamentalists who are holding on to the literal truth of the Bible, challenging the modernists who are, embracing evolution and stuff. And that's going to be challenged in the John Scopes trial, a trial in Tennessee in which the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, is going to challenge the Butler Act, a law in Tennessee making it illegal to teach evolution. And so that trial will be be covered nationwide. And so a lot of our social norms that we brought in with us from, the 1800s and the early 1900s, they're starting to be challenged. And so you can kind of say the 1920s were definitely a turning point for society in America. And those are just some of the changes. Prohibition, that was, the fact is that they were having, we always talk about the roaring 20s, yet their alcohol was illegal during this time. But as we know, people got around that. The 18th Amendment prohibited the manufacture and sale of alcohol, and the Volstead Act is going to that's the power that government's going to give to enforce the 18th Amendment. It was mostly opposed in large cities. It's going to be the agrarian areas, the middle part of the country and stuff that are going to support the idea of prohibition. And so, and then of course, as I mentioned, going to war against Germany and the whole beer thing, that actually added to it as well. So you're going to see, I'll get to, Joan, I see your question. I'll get to that in just a second. We're going to see corruption start to grow. We're going to see the rise of organized crime and, the mafia, as we refer to it, Al Capone and Lucky Luciano and Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky, and all these guys are going to rise to power in the crime world because of prohibition and bringing alcohol into the country. So basically, that's what what's going on with prohibition. Now, Jonah, you asked why the teaching of evolution was important to the ACLU. The American Civil Liberties Union was basically they were organized to defend the rights of Americans, and the idea was that the Tennessee was blocking the teaching of a specific science or a specific idea. And so they believed that all ideas should be, treated equally, should be shared, and allow people to decide for themselves. And when Tennessee passed that law, they basically started to say, well, you're trying to force, in a sense, because you're trying to maintain the fundamental ideas of the Bible, you're trying to force that on to everyone, and you can't do that. So we're going to sue so evolution can be taught as well. So it was about freedom of choice, freedom of thought, and stuff like that. That's why they took that on. Roosevelt gave more power to the president, CJ, through the Roosevelt Corollary, through his actions going over to negotiate the Russo-Japanese War Treaty, through his involvement in Panama and stuff like that. He just became more of a proactive president. So whereas you're not seeing actual legislative power given to Roosevelt, you're seeing Roosevelt kind of redefining the role of the presidency or the president within foreign affairs. So that's what I mean by he gave more power to the president, because we'll see other presidents follow that line of behavior and stuff like that. Okay. Okay, African Americans, man, I already talked about a lot of these, but I'll hit on them again. Don't forget about the Great Migration, the spread of jazz music throughout the country. The Harlem Renaissance was huge. Langston Hughes was a poet during this time, and I believe in the video I talked about some of his poetry. Louis Armstrong, famous jazz musician. Marcus Garvey, interesting guy. Marcus Garvey was the lead of the United Negro Improvement Association. He started a movement to get African Americans to go back to Africa. Now, he did promote the idea of Black pride. He promoted the idea of Black-owned businesses, but his ultimate goal was to have African Americans go back to Africa. That was what the UNIA was. I don't know. Let me see if I do. No, I don't. W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, also very important to the African American growth in our country during this time, because what they're going to be, Washington versus Du Bois is Booker T. Washington believed that, they both believed in education for the African American, but Booker T. Washington believed in gaining respect from America right where you are. So basically, he says, I think if I'm gonna mess up this phrase, but he says, you row the boat you're in. And so he goes, if you're a farmer, if you're an African American farmer, you be the best farmer you can right now, and by working hard, and by following the path to do the best you can in life, that will gain the respect of America, and that will help lift African Americans in American society. W.E.B. Du Bois said, no, we have rights based on the U.S. Constitution. Those are guaranteed. We shouldn't have to prove ourselves again. And so, they both push for education of African Americans, but Booker T. Washington focused a lot on the trades, where W.E.B. Du Bois focused a lot on the academia and stuff like that. They both had the same end goal in mind, but they had a different way of getting there. Ivan, you asked about the Hawley-Smoot tariff. That's actually going to deal with, that's going to be during Hoover's presidency leading into the Great Depression. So you will not see that on the exam, but basically what it did was it raised tariffs, thinking that would increase American industry and help pull us out of the Depression. It actually drove us deeper into the Depression because other countries responded to that tariff with tariffs of their own. Finally, another thing with regards to society, don't forget that you had a lot of authors and stuff come out following World War I, kind of discouraged with America and what they saw during the war. So you're going to see what's called the lost generation, where they're going to criticize parts of the 1920s, parts of American culture. First of all, World War I. The fact that we got involved and why did we get involved. But they're also going to start challenging some of those traditional values, the small town values of America, the fundamental religious views, the materialism of the decade. They're just going to kind of just look at society and say, this is all the stuff that's wrong and needs to be fixed. And so you'll see that in a lot of the books that they write. So some of the greatest authors of our time, actually. All right, guys, that is everything. So I got through it all in just right at an hour. So now I'm going to open it up for any more questions you might have. You can text or you can just type them in there. And, we're almost done just in time to go watch the State of the Union address. So you can thank me for that. What else you guys got? You guys got anything else? Nothing coming up yet. Got all this stuff here. Nothing on here. All right, so I'll talk for just another minute so if you guys have any more questions. But bottom line, test tomorrow is 32 multiple choice questions, and then you also have the SAQ. Addison, you want me to go over the 5 points of Wilson's plan again? Are you talking about the 14 points, the big things you need to remember? Is that what you're asking me? I believe that is. So what I'm going to do... Okay, so the very first one is the freedom of the seas. So basically, freedom of the seas is the idea that, any type of... merchant ships should have the freedom to travel under a neutral flag, even in times of war, and not have to worry about getting, attacked and stuff. He also wanted to eliminate economic trade barriers between different countries, so open trade between the countries, reduce the size of military, so disarmament amongst the countries, reduce alliances. That's kind of where the League of Nations is going to come in. So no secret alliances, no secret treaties. Get rid of, so colonization, sort of start to decolonize different areas. And that kind of goes to his idea of moral diplomacy, the spread of democracy, allow countries to have self-determination. And we know that was just in Europe, but the idea of self-determination. And finally, that League of Nations. Those are the key points that he was looking for in his 14 points. So freedom of the seas, free trade, disarmament, reduction of allies, no secret treaties, decolonization, and the League of Nations. That's the main thing. Imperialism caused World War I because you had throughout, the Gilded Age going into the early 1900s, you had this race for power, a race for land and stuff, and that's countries building power, and that's when alliances are going to start being formed and everything like that. So as these countries are trying to build up their own individual power, then they're also trying to build up their own, these alliances to even strengthen the power that they already have. So that's kind of how imperialism flowed into that. Examples of moral diplomacy. Just remember that Wilson, this is prior to World War I, believed that you could have peace without war. You didn't have to use the military to extend peace. And what he wanted to do was spread democracy through the world. He was a big purveyor of self-determination. So that's what moral diplomacy was. I mean, he saw Roosevelt with big stick diplomacy, where Roosevelt used the military, to kind of, extend our influences especially through Latin and Central America. He watched Taft with dollar diplomacy, where we used our businesses, our banks and everything to extend our influence. Now he wants to use moral diplomacy, where we use our government, we use our ideals to spread throughout these countries. But as I mentioned in class, he's actually going to use military intervention more than any other of the other two progressive presidents. So his idea of spreading democracy really didn't work that well. So, all right. Let's see. I think I had a question come in here. Let me see. Yes, I did. Why did we intervene in the Dominican Republic? Basically, anytime we intervened in any of these Central American countries or something like that, it had something to do with protecting our economic assets. And it might be a situation, and I know it happened in Nicaragua, and I believe it happened in the Dominican Republic as well, where you have a source or a group trying to overthrow the local government. If that new government coming in is not going to, if we did not feel that they would basically support American economic interests, then we would intervene. We would get involved, and we would go in and help the sitting government and say, we're gonna protect our interest here in whatever country this is, and we're going to do that by preventing an overthrow of your government. So that's predominantly what happened in almost all of these Central American countries that we went into, and Latin American countries as well. All right. Okay. Anything else, guys? I'm looking. Okay. I don't see anything popping up, so I think that's going to do it. Again, what you can, review those terms. Make sure you know the terms. I would pay attention to your notes. Look at different. I think go through your textbook. Look at different cartoons, political cartoons and stuff like that, because I know there's a number of political cartoons on the test. Some you've seen, some you should be able to interpret. And so that's going to be a big thing. But I really think terminology It's going to be a big thing on this test. I'm sorry, I'm answering a text here real quick. Um, so focus on terms, focus on your notes, and I think you'll be fine. Um, Actually, it didn't originate from the Hun. It originated from Germans' alliance with Austria-Hungary, so the Austrian-Hungarians. So, and they're also referring back to, like Attila the Hun and everything. They're kind of putting the two together, and that whole idea was to dehumanize the enemy. So they used the image of the Hun from Asia, but then they also took it as a shortening of the Austria-Hungary idea. So, okay. Alrighty. So I think that's going to do it. No other questions. Let me see. One more call for text. No more text messages coming in. So we're awesome. We're out of here. You guys have a nice evening. We will see you tomorrow. And go watch the State of the Union. It'd probably be boring, but you always should watch it. Know what they're saying about us. All right. Good night, guys.